Good afternoon. My name is Maxim Schreier. I'm a professor at Boston College, and I direct the project on Russian and Eurasian Jewry here at the Davis Center at Harvard University. And I'd like to welcome you to the first of our fall events, lecture series and seminars. This is a great event that I'm very much looking forward to with Professor Sergei Khan of Dartmouth, whom I'll introduce in just a little while. But before I do that, I'd like to say that the project for Russian and Eurasian Jewry is now in its fourth year. It's generously underwritten by Genesis Philanthropy Group. It's also supported by the Harvard Center for Jewish Studies, and of course by the Davis Center, which gives me a chance to thank all my colleagues, and especially Penny Skalnick, Mary McCreel, and Danielle Wallner, who are just doing miracles with all the digital technology. And I also want to highlight that our next event will be on November 18th. You will also be able to watch it live, and we will have Luba Jurgensen, who is a professor at the Sorbonne, a cultural historian and a translingual writer, and she will be speaking of Russian Jewry under Stalin. And now back to Sergei Khan, who I'm very, very happy to welcome and to greet. He is a colleague and a friend whom I admire greatly. Sergei Khan was born in Moscow and studied at the history department of Moscow State University between 1970 and 1973. He and his family emigrated to the United States in 1974. And that same year, he enrolled in Boston University's undergraduate university professors program, where he received a BA in anthropology and religion. He then pursued graduate studies at the University of Chicago, receiving his PhD in anthropology in 1982. The focus of Khan's ethnographic and archival research for his dissertation was on the pre-Christian as well as Russian Orthodox mortuary and memorial rituals of the Tlingit, in Russian Tlinkiti, the indigenous people of southeastern Alaska. Professor Khan is the author and editor of a number of books, including books on Tlingit and Alaska Native history and culture, the impact of Orthodox missionization on Native Alaskans, Native American ethnology, and the anthropology of death and dying. And I'll just mention some of his books: Symbolic Immortality, the Tlingit Potlatch of the 19th century, Death in the Early 21st Century, Authority, Innovation, and Mortuary Rites. However, here Professor Khan is speaking in his capacity as someone who is doing really cutting-edge work at the intersection of anthropology and Jewish Russian history and culture. Many of you know his book, Lev Sternberg, Anthropologist, Russian socialist, Jewish activist, which came out in 2009. It's a book that I personally learned a great deal from. And today, Professor Khan will speak to us on the topic that is part of his book project, an intellectual biography of Alexander Goldenweiser, a major figure in American anthropology, born in Russia to a prominent family. Sergei, it's a pleasure to have you. Dobry den, and I'm going to turn the floor over to you.
Well, thank you, Maxim. I appreciate the kind introduction. I also would like to thank the Genesis Philanthropy, the Davis Center, and Maxim personally for inviting me. It's a pleasure. I am affiliated with the Davis Center, so this is something I was looking forward to. This project is part of my interest in the history of anthropology, and it's history of Russian and American anthropology, and especially the intersection of those two streams. And I should say that Alexander Goldenweiser has always been seen in the history of anthropology field as an American. And I have argued that you have to really look at his Russian and to a lesser extent his Jewish background to fully grasp not only his anthropological contributions, but his role as a public intellectual, which I'll be speaking about. So, American anthropologist with Russian Jewish roots. A little bit about the background of Goldenweiser. Alexander Alexandrovich, known as Shura, Goldenweiser, was born in Kiev in 1880. His was a family of highly educated, cultivated, and assimilated Russian Jews who looked toward the West for progressive ideas and valued high culture a great deal. Shura's father, Alexander Solomonovich Goldenweiser, was a prominent Jewish lawyer and a liberal who devoted much of his practice to helping the poor and the underprivileged, including the Jews victimized by Tsarist regime. A great admirer of Western democracy, Alexander Solomonovich was a follower of Herbert Spencer, whose libertarian and anarchist defense of the rights of the individual against state appealed to him. At the same time, in the late 1890s, Goldenweiser's father became a follower of Tolstoy's humanistic philosophy, and especially the great novelist's sharp critique of the state's right to impose harsh punishment, particularly capital punishment, on convicted criminals. I would add that there was a kind of a cult of Tolstoy in the Goldenweiser family, and that extended to his children. This combination of an interest in the social sciences and a passion for social justice was passed on to each of the three sons of Alexander Solomonovich: Alexander himself, his brother Emmanuel, born 3 years later, who became a prominent American economist, and the third younger brother, born in 1890, Alexei Goldenweiser, who was a lawyer and a legal scholar and worked on behalf of stateless refugees, including Vladimir and Vera Nabokov, which might interest Maxim, who's written about them. Eager to protect his oldest son from the anti-Semitic atmosphere of the early 1900s Russia and to give him an opportunity to live in a democratic country, Goldenweiser Sr. took Shura to America in 1900. By then, the young man had graduated from the well-known Kievo-Pecherskaya Gymnasium and completed 1 year of study at Kiev University. This is a picture of the Goldenweiser children that I was fortunate to obtain from his granddaughter, who lives in the United States. There are 3 brothers and 2 sisters. These 2 sisters were twins, so we don't know which one is Nadine and which is Helen. And the 2 sisters suffered a tragic fate. They were in France as immigrants during the Vichy regime and were betrayed by their neighbors and died in Auschwitz. So that was a terrible tragedy. Alexei Goldenweiser, here he's the boy. He came to America much later in the late 30s, right before the war, and was a very prominent person among Russian Jewish immigrant circles in New York City. And unlike his 2 brothers, he lived a long life, died in 1979. In the US, Alexander Goldenweiser enrolled at Harvard as a special student and studied English and mathematics for 1 year. However, in 1901, he transferred to Columbia, where he obtained all of his degrees, including a PhD in anthropology in 1910. His mentor, his mentor, who considered him to be one of his brightest students, was Franz Boas, the father of American anthropology. Here's a picture of Goldenweiser as a Kiev student, Kiev University student. His mentor, Franz Boas, considered him to be one of the brightest students of his. And Goldenweiser belonged to the first cohort of American-trained, Boas-trained young anthropologists. Quite a few of them were Jews, and mostly European-born. And here's a picture of that gang with Goldenweiser sitting very relaxed in the front row, a real dandy. While in New York City, Goldenweiser, known to his American friends as Goldie, was the center of a small but lively group of young intellectuals, most of them anthropologists or anthropology graduate students like himself, including Robert Lowy, Paul Radin, and a number of others. They gathered frequently to discuss their discipline, as well as broader issues such as philosophy of the social sciences, psychology, politics, and literature. Goldenweiser was the organizer and the heart and soul of several study circles krushki of intellectual groups. In 1906, Goldenweiser got married to a Russian Jewish immigrant, Anna Hollow. 8 years later, his daughter Alice was born, but in 1926-7, the marriage ended in ugly divorce. Goldenweiser's only ethnographic field research involved several trips to the Six Nations Iroquois Reserve in Ontario, Canada, between 1911 and 1913, where he worked with Iroquois consultants. He did publish several articles based on that research, but the full reports of his work were never published. He enjoyed ethnographic research, got along well with his native consultants, but spent a limited amount of time in the field because of the need to earn a living by teaching. There are also rumors that he was not made unwelcome on the reserve because of an affair he had with a native lady. I should point out that Goldenweiser was a womanizer. That was well known. And also a passionate billiard player. From 1910 to 1919, Goldenweiser taught at Columbia as an instructor and eventually as a lecturer. Although he earned a reputation as an excellent teacher, his personal conduct was not beyond reproach. One example, he borrowed over 200 books from Columbia University Library and never returned them. Because of that and other reasons that I will not go into here, Boas was unable to secure a permanent position for Goldenweiser at Columbia, and eventually he had to leave. However, when in 1919, a prominent group of progressive New York intellectuals organized the New School for Social Research, Goldenweiser was among them. It is there that this outstanding teacher introduced such future luminaries of American anthropology as Ruth Benedict, Leslie White, and Mel Herskowitz, and several others, to the discipline, and then directed them to Columbia to pursue graduate work with Boas. Once again, his serious personal indiscretion undermined his job security and forced him to stop teaching at the school in 1926 and to leave New York. In fact, this was the time when he was going through this divorce and unable to pay alimony, he had to escape to Mexico. So there's some dramatic stories about Goldenweiser. Upon returning to New York after 1927, he resumed teaching at the Rand School, which he taught before. Rand School was operated by the Socialist Party of America. He also gave a lot of public lectures on various topics. After the new school terminated his appointment, Goldenweiser became the member of the editorial board, as well as a major contributor to a well-known and important Encyclopedia of the Social Sciences, a major multi-volume reference work. In fact, he was one of the creators of the whole project. The need to support himself also forced him to give public lectures, write numerous articles on a variety of hot-button issues of the day, as well as book reviews in such liberal and left-wing magazines as The Nation, The New Republic, The Modern Quarterly, as well as progressive Jewish magazines such as the Menorah Journal and The Reflex. In 1930, Shura finally obtained a relatively permanent position as sociology and anthropology lecturer at Reed College at Portland, Oregon. In addition, he taught at the University of Oregon Extension, where he offered a variety of courses, including Russian history. Incidentally, in 1918, the Carnegie Institution announced that it was going to publish a book by Goldenweiser entitled The Present Situation in Russia and Its Economic and Social Background. Unfortunately, like several other book projects of his, it was never completed, and its manuscript was never found. While at Reed, Goldenweiser married a young woman named Ethel Cantor, with whom he finally found personal happiness. While he continued to enjoy a reputation as a great teacher, he viewed Portland as a backwater and made several attempts to obtain a position in a larger West Coast cities such as Seattle and San Francisco. However, except for a one-year visiting appointment at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, plus occasional summer teaching at sunny Buffalo, Stanford, and University of Washington, none of his efforts came to fruition. Eventually, his reputation as iconoclast and a leftist led to some serious conflicts between him and Reed's administration, so that in 1939, the administration decided not to renew his contract. Goldenweiser died suddenly of a heart attack on July 6, 1940. As far as his major contribution to scholarship are concerned, in addition to his classic work on totemism, which was his dissertation, I should mention his frequently cited 1913 article, The Principle of Limited Possibilities in the Development of Culture, and his concept of involution developed in an important 1936 paper. Generally speaking, Goldie was much more interested in broad theoretical questions than many of his fellow Boasians, including psychoanalysis, and his works frequently made reference to the key role of psychological motivation in social life and cultural production. What also distinguished Goldenweiser from many other leading figures in American anthropology of pre-World War II years was his interest in crossing interdisciplinary boundaries and engaging in dialogue with sociologists, psychologists, historians, and other social scientists. The breadth of his scholarly interest is best illustrated by a collection of essays that he co-edited with William Ogburn, a prominent sociologist, entitled The Social Sciences and Their Interrelations, published in 1927. Goldenweiser was also the first student of Boas to publish a comprehensive textbook in anthropology entitled Early Civilization, Introduction to Anthropology. It was based on his lectures at the New School. 15 years later, he published another textbook, Anthropology and Introduction to Primitive Culture. In addition, he produced a popular book called Robots and Gods, Essay on Craft and Mind, as well as an important collection of essays called Psychology and Culture. The reason Goldenweiser gave so many public lectures and published so many opinion pieces and book reviews in the popular press has at least in part to do with the fact that he had to earn a living. But he also was, as I already mentioned, genuinely interested in commenting on a variety of burning political issues of the day. For example, pacifism versus militarism during World War I, government proposals to restrict immigration, and especially theories of racial superiority directed against undesirable immigrants. He also commented on race, on African American condition in America, on sex and gender. Unlike his mentor Boas, who tended to separate his teaching from his concern with the political issues of the day, Goldenweiser brought those concerns into the classroom, especially at the New School. The issues that inspired Goldie to train his anthropological lens on indicate that his political views fell very much in line with those of other American liberals of the progressive era. On some key issues, however, he stood to the left of the liberals, leaning closer to the independent radicals and socialists of all stripes, although he would never identify with or join either the Socialist or the Communist Party. Given his affiliation with the Rand School and the topics of some of his public lecture, he did acquire a reputation of a radical, which followed him to the West Coast. Thus, as a member of the Rand School faculty, he took part in the 1928 conference organized by the League of Industrial Democracy, a moderate socialist organization. The theme of the conference was Socialism in Our Time, and among its participants was Norman Thomas, Socialist Party's candidate for president in 1928. One anthropologist who was Goldie's undergraduate student in the 1930s later speculated that Goldie might have been an anarchist. This would make some sense since there's evidence that he shared his father's appreciation for Spencer's libertarian anarchism and remained a lifelong admirer of Tolstoy's Christian anarchism. One interesting piece of evidence of Goldie's anarchist views, which made him an opponent of a powerful state, is a passage from an unpublished paper, The Future of the Social Sciences, that he presented at a meeting of the Pacific Sociological Society in the mid-30s. In that passage, he not only criticized the totalitarian states, Italy, Germany, Soviet Union, but made the following comment about America under President Roosevelt's New Deal, and I quote, "An equally significant instance of group control is presented by the United States, in which a semi-dictatorial executive branch is assuming unprecedented functions of transformation and control, checked only by surviving fragments of democratic ideology and the rapidly fading ghost of what was once the economic doctrine of laissez-faire. So there's a kind of libertarian streak in his thinking. Now, I want to turn now to the topics that should be of particular interest to historians of Russia and of American anthropology. And that is Goldenweiser's critique of socialism. Although Goldenweiser published only a few articles expressing his political views, one does sense that he was more favorably inclined towards socialism in the 20s than in the 30s. And the reason for that change clearly had a lot to do with news from the Soviet Union, the one country where capitalism had been defeated and a new social order was being built. Unlike his fellow American-born liberals and leftists, many of whom still claimed that they could not trust the reports coming from the USSR, Shura received detailed first-hand information about the Bolshevik Red Terror from his younger brother Alexei, who escaped from the Soviet Union in 1922, in a very dramatic fashion, actually. In fact, it was Alexei's letters and published accounts of the Bolshevik persecution and destruction of much of the old Russian intelligentsia that made such a strong impression on Goldie that in the early 20s, he actually undertook a series of public lectures in New York to raise money for the surviving victims of that anti-intelligentsia terror, Russian scientists. Here's how he spoke about this terror at the socialist conference mentioned earlier. Quote, "The recent events in Russia have given us a very sad and in many ways tragic example of the fate of the intellectual proletariat at the hands of the revolutionary proletariat. What happened there was, as you know, that the revolution, once successful, rode roughshod over the flower of the Russian intelligentsia and wiped them out, or very nearly so. And when the revolution realized soon after that it needed them, there were relatively few left to call upon." End of quote. Goldenweiser warned his leftist audience that if the socialist revolution was to occur in the United States, such a tragedy had to be avoided, and that a strong alliance between the industrial and the intellectual proletariat had to be built. Goldenweiser's negative view of the Bolshevik regime became much stronger in the early 30s, as news of Stalin's terror reached the West. Thus, in his 1933 essay, Stalin and Trotsky, he doesn't mince words in describing the misery brought to the industrial workers and especially the peasants by Stalin's socialism in one country project. He also expresses his distaste for a total control imposed on the long-suffering Russian people, his words, by an all-powerful secret police, and the politicization of the sciences and the arts. He ends his essay by critiquing Stalin's system from the point of view of a democratic, humanistic, and anarchist socialism. Here's another quote. "Stalin may succeed in erecting a socialist state in which workers, perhaps peasants, will enjoy more wealth and power than ever before, and capitalists will become an extinct species. But wealth and power are not wisdom, not beauty, nor free creativeness, not sensitivity or human sympathy, or pen-mindedness, or the rights of the individual, or peace. How these values, and are they not as important for civilization as the proletarian surgery upon capitalism, are to be maintained or developed in a socialism such as Stalin is building, is not easy for us to see." By the mid-30s, Goldenweiser had come to a firm conclusion that there wasn't much of a difference between the fascist states of Italy and Germany and the Soviet Russia. Thus, while many of America's leftists and liberals, including some prominent anthropologists, having swallowed Stalin's Popular Front propaganda, still favored the USSR over Nazi Germany and refused to condemn the Moscow show trials of the late 30s, Goldenweiser's anti-dictatorship position had become firm and clear. To me, the interesting thing is that he approached the new totalitarian regimes of Europe both as a social scientist and a humanistic anarchist intellectual. Hence, he spoke of a great danger of these dictatorial regimes due to, quote, "the perennial problem of the relationship of individual and society, of the state and the person, has been solved by dictatorial system in favor of the state." In a sociological model that he proposes in some of his essays in the 30s, a truly democratic society, described by him as a living organic whole, is juxtaposed to an aggregate of robots controlled by a social engineer that characterizes modern day dictatorship. And that popular book, Robots and Gods, he talks a lot about this issue. Another topic I want to briefly address is Goldenweiser's view of Marxist theory. Goldenweiser's most explicit critique of both the Marxist theory and its Bolshevik version in action appeared in 1935 in the journal Modern Quarterly, a left-wing magazine, which asked him and several other prominent left-leaning intellectuals to discuss why they were not Marxist. That was the question. Goldenweiser begins his essay, Why I'm Not a Marxist, by stating that, quote, as an emotional reaction and a social aspiration, Marxism has my unmitigated sympathy. But what he did reject was Marxism as, quote, an ambitious and carefully compacted theory of history and an ideology used by Stalin's dictatorship in its most daring experiment in social control and culture building. It is not surprising that Goldenweiser, a committed anti-evolutionist Boasian anthropologist, would reject Marxist philosophy of history. For him and for the neo-Kantians whom he had been influenced by, history had no laws. He also rejected Marx's economic determinism. In his own words, while it was true that the economy constituted the very lifeblood of the social process, to say that man cannot get along without a thing is not to say that the thing determines the man. What also troubled this Boasian anthropologist was Marx's, quote, featuring of the group as against the individual and his conception of spiritual values and ideas in general as epiphenomenal and non-causal, as well as his attempts to explain away such key aspects of human life as science, philosophy, art, literature, religion, or the personal relations between human beings. In the end, Goldenweiser viewed Marxism as nothing but a conceptual precipitate, those are his words, of the era that followed the Industrial Revolution and an ideological expression of a particular and passing phase in the history of society. Once Goldie turned his attention to the society that professed to be the only one in the world to put Marxist theory into practice, he found very little to admire. What troubled him greatly was the fact that economic exploitation had been replaced by the proletarian dictatorship, which, despite the official rhetoric, remained the rule of the minority. Moreover, he continued, quote, it is a rule by force, duly flavored with ruthlessness. Nor is this feature incidental. On the contrary, it's inevitable and essential, as the Marxian communists are not disposed to deny. Inevitably, also, the centralized power of the Soviet dictatorship operates through a many-headed bureaucracy, end of quote. However, what disturbed Goldenweiser most was the use of violence by this new bureaucratic state to maintain control over its citizens. And here's another quote. No dictatorship, moreover, could sustain itself in power unless shielded by the protective mechanism of a secret organization. This is so in the Soviet Union as in Italy and Germany. What is worse, such a bodyguard of the dictatorship can operate successfully only when supported, at least to a degree, by the general population. And so we find in the Soviet Union, as in Italy and Germany, a moral code which puts premium on one of the most loathsome forms of behavior, namely spying on one's neighbors with the intent to hurt him. And let me repeat, this is not incidental, it is organic. Without this accessory, dictatorship would perish, end of quote. The essay ends with a summary of the author's own credo. And here I think we hear the voice of an old libertarian anarchist, a follower of Spencer and Tolstoy, possibly also of such Russian populist or narodnik thinkers as Mikhailovsky. Quote, I am an individualist. As such, I place the individual both at the beginning and at the end of the social process. Human society was built out of needs, proclivities, and achievements of individuals, and it must return to them for a test of its changes of achievements. In the modern world, for the first time in history perhaps, the individual is coming into his own, insofar as creativeness, self-expression, intellectual grasp, and a rich, adventurous life become possible, at least as a feasible ideal. This I regard as a true differential of humanity, which should under no conditions be swept aside. Should it prove necessary to put the brakes on individual freedom, this operation should be performed in the realization that a necessary evil being perpetrated. It need hardly be said that I abominate the use of force in human affairs, as well as more broadly all forms of human engineering, which implies the robotization of the individual. I do, of course, admit that social effectiveness can, under certain conditions, be thus achieved, but mere social effectiveness leaves me quite unmoved if accompanied by a loss of individual initiative and a hindrance to the unfolding of man's capacities, end of quote. Goldenweiser never gave up his conviction that America was far from a real democracy, or that capitalism was a flawed socioeconomic system. What he came to reject in the last decade of his life was the idea of a possibility of a radical socialist transformation in this country, in its socioeconomic system that many of his former left-wing comrades still advocated. In fact, in his 1936 paper, Nature and Tasks of the Social Sciences, he characterized the calls for such revolutionary transformation insanely, if not criminally ambitious, considering our ignorance and inexperience in social manipulation. His own solution to America's problems was a total reorganization and radical improvement in its educational system, aimed at producing, quote, an educated, progressive, tolerant, and engaged citizenry, end of quote, a necessary prerequisite for true democracy. In this, he remained an admirer and a follower of his former senior Columbian colleague, the great American educator John Dewey. The last aspect of Goldenweiser's worldview that I'd like to address in this talk is his views on this Jewish question. While Goldenweiser considered himself an expert on Russian history and politics, he never claimed to be a scholar of Jewish history or Jewish culture. In fact, his writings on Jewish subjects are few and far in between. This makes sense given the fact he did not participate in any Jewish organization or served on the editorial board of any Jewish periodical. If he did pen an occasional article for the Menorah Journal or another American Jewish periodical, it was usually upon the request of the editors. Nonetheless, in the early to mid-1920s, his opinion on some topics of great concern to American Jews was sought by the liberal Jewish press, and it is not surprising. After all, this was a time of the rise of nativist ideology in the US, with its pseudoscientific racist and eugenic theories and its anti-immigrant propaganda, Nordic mythology, and increased anti-Semitism. This ideological attack on African Americans and other undesirable non-Anglo-Saxons, particularly Jews, had some unfortunate practical consequences for the rising Jewish middle class, such as job discrimination in certain professions and a quota system in admission to Ivy League colleges, including Harvard and Dartmouth. To counteract this dangerous myth of the Jewish racial inferiority and the incompatibility between Jewish and American values, American Jewish organizations of various stripes turned to those prominent anthropologists who had opposed this pseudoscience for quite some time. The leader of the group was none other than Goldenweiser's own illustrious mentor, Franz Boas. He had conducted his own research in biological anthropology, which had undermined many of the central arguments of the racialist ideologues, and had written about the subject in scholarly as well as popular publications. However, for various reasons, Boas preferred to concentrate his critique on the racist theories of African American inferiority rather than anti-Semitic ones. Goldenweiser, however, who was well known to the educated Jewish public as a prominent Jewish American anthropologist and professor, was willing to speak publicly and write on the subject of race theory, whether it was aimed at African Americans, Asian immigrants, or Jews. And thus, between 1922 and 1925, he gave presentations to various Jewish audiences, including synagogues, banquets of the Menorah Society, a National Jewish College student organization, which actually started at Harvard, and national meetings of the Jewish social workers. As always, he did this in part to earn money, but he also seemed to enjoy challenging his audience with some of his more provocative views. His Jewish audiences were keenly interested in the subject, not only because they wished to learn from him how to defend themselves from the attacks of the likes of Nordic eugenicist Madison Grant, for example. The 1920s was the time when American Jewish intellectuals and the educated public were debating whether Jews in general, American Jews in particular, constituted a race or something else like a religious group, a nation, a people, or a culture. As far as the notion that race was to a large extent an invention, a state of mind, as he put it, Goldenweiser echoed Boas. He rejected any notions of racial inferiority outright and demonstrated his debt to psychoanalysis, calling racial prejudice a complex, as well as a phenomenon of group psychology, reflecting, in his words, the urge of self-interest, not readily amenable to the influence of reason or argument. However, he went much further, argued that there was nothing wrong with the assimilation of the American Jews into the mainstream society. Similar to Boas, he asserted the only way to eliminate anti-Semitism altogether was to have the Jews mix with the other ethnic groups of the country. Generally speaking, Goldenweiser was rather skeptical about any public campaigns against anti-Semitism, arguing that the best way to deal with it was to ignore it and thus let it run its course. He did concede that proper public education might help reduce its influence, but did not place much hope in that. Such views expressed by the distinguished Jewish professor from New York School, which was how the Emmerich Speaker Bureau advertised him, indicate that he didn't see much worth preserving in the Jewish religion or culture in America, be it Judaism, Yiddish language, or specific ethnic customs and traditions. A highly assimilated Jew, Goldenweiser was equally dismissive of Zionist ideology. Thus, in his review of the book Extinction and Survival by an American economist and publicist, a Jewish publicist, Elisha Friedman, which had a strong Zionist message, Goldie referred to Hebrew culture as being dead in Palestine and being, quote, not Zion, but a colonial enterprise on a small scale, the future which is still in doubt, end of quote. What worried this anarchist most was that if the Jews would acquire their own state in Palestine, they might turn from oppressed to the oppressors of the Arabs. Despite expressing his approval of the fact that eventually most diaspora Jews would be assimilated into the societies in which they would be living, Goldenweiser did see them playing an important special role in the present time. In the post-World War I world, where the first attempts were being made by some of the Western states to reduce international tensions and avoid another world war, Jews, in his view, could actually play quite an important role. Not surprisingly, Goldenweiser, a modern-day Jew, and especially a member of the Jewish intelligentsia, was an internationalist, as he put it. Quote, wherever he may reside, he, the Jew, is able to preserve a certain aloofness with reference to purely local issues, and thus be saved from the buncombe of national conceits. He is also relatively free from narrow traditionalism. More often than not, he is at home in more than one country and not infrequently in more than one continent. Not being fanatically addicted to any nation, he is also able to appreciate the worth of all. Having suffered persecution himself, Goldenweiser's ideal Jew was also a natural opponent of racial or ethnic discrimination. Moreover, the Jew's national extraterritoriality made him not only an internationalist, but an individualist. Quote, an intellectual freelance who is capable of judging economic, social, and political issues on their merits, unencumbered by the historic dogmas, prejudices, and bias of those whose egos shot through with national self-consciousness. In other words, Goldenweiser, a rational social analyst, ended his analysis of the role of the Jews in the perilous post-World War I era with a rather romantic image of a cosmopolitan Jewish intellectual, immune to nationalism and ethnic prejudice, and open to an international exchange of ideas. Here's how he described this ideal Jew in the closing passage of his 1922 essay concerning racial differences. Perhaps the wandering Jew of the poet and the traveling salesman of modern industrialism will find their third and worthier brother in the international culture hero, capital letters, of the future, the Jew apostle of peace and goodwill amongst the peoples and races of the world, end of quote. To conclude, in the 19-teens, Alexander Goldenweiser was a member of a small cohort of the first generation of American anthropologists. Many of them were Jews or at least European born, and politically, like their mentor Boas, stood to the left of the American academic mainstream. The next cohort of American anthropologists, those trained in the 20s, also include a number of leftists. During this decade, espousing left-wing views often meant to being pro-communist or at least pro-Soviet. When the show trials of the 1930s soured many of the US intellectuals on the Bolshevik experiment, some of them turned to Trotskyism or other brands of anti-Soviet and anti-communist socialism. This is where Goldenweiser parted company with his colleagues. Although he remained a strong critic of capitalism, an anarchist, and a democratic socialist all of his life, he never harbored any illusions about Stalinism, Trotskyism, or the Western parties that supported either one of these models of communist building. By the 1930s, he had also become disillusioned with American socialists. I've argued here and elsewhere in my book project that it was Goldie's Russian background and his ties with the anti-Soviet immigrant community that helped him understand the evils of the Soviet regime. Now, as far as his views on Jewish culture, Jewish assimilation, and the role of Jews in the world, they were those of a classic product of the late 19th century, assimilated, westernized, cosmopolitan, and liberal Russian Jewish intelligentsia. Having lived in the United States for 40 years of his life, Goldenweiser never felt fully at home, so his cosmopolitanism comes through. I would argue that he felt equally at home in Berlin, Paris, or New York. There's some interesting things that, for example, he never learned how to drive. He always took taxis. And his general demeanor was that of a Western European intellectual rather than an American. I think I'm going to stop there and be delighted to take questions from the audience.
Thank you, Sergey. Thank you so much for this illuminating presentation. And I know there are questions, but I'd like to just point out that your story highlights a really tumultuous life of a person who was, it seems, bicultural, if not tricultural, but not fully at home, either in his Russianness or in his Americanness or in his Jewishness. And it seems in a sense that your story also highlights some of the contradictions of the American Jewish experience, which are really so much on display today, both in the way the Jewish community in America is responding to this election and to Israel. And so I thank you for that. It's also a delight to have an anthropologist join our group of scholars. We've had not just historians and students of literature, we've had musicologists, we've had experts in chess, but never an anthropologist with a Jewish-Russian focus. So thank you very much for that. I'd like to ask you a question going back to the beginning of your talk, which may or may not elicit a detailed response, but I am curious whether the Tolstoyan background and the deep influence of Tolstoyanism in his parents' household cast a longer shadow on his thinking, specifically on his thinking on the Jewish question. What I mean is, as you know, Tolstoy was a passionate advocate of equality of all ethnic, religious, and national groups in the Russian Empire, but he was very reluctant to speak openly on the Jewish question. And there is a lot of evidence, which I think makes some students of Tolstoy's legacy slightly uncomfortable. I'm curious if you could sort of walk us through the Tolstoyan legacy in Goldenweiser's American life.
Now, it's a very good question, Maxim. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of evidence of direct influence because Goldenweiser never wrote much about Tolstoy. There's one review. He reviewed Alexandra Tolstoy's memoir about her father, Alexandra, who lived in the United States. He reviewed that very favorably, and in the review, he calls himself an old Russian. So, and if I have time, I could mention a few vignettes from his life that show that he really thought of himself as a Russian more than as a Jew. But as far as influence of Tolstoy, it was profound. I did not mention that a cousin of Alexander, also named Alexander Borisovich, was a very famous composer and professor of Moscow Conservatory who remained in the Soviet Union and lived a long life and actually left an interesting memoir. He's also known for playing chess with Tolstoy and playing piano to entertain the great Tolstoy. And Alexander's father, Alexander Solomonovich, wrote a very important book called «Преступление как наказание, наказание как преступление», which is based on Воскресение, where he argued very passionately that the state did not have the right to sentence people to death. And Alexander's younger brother, Emmanuel, translated their father's essay into English, and it became widely known. And Tolstoy was very happy to see that work being publicized. I don't know if Goldenweiser's skepticism about preservation of Jewish culture in diaspora had to do with Tolstoy. I mean, he was an individualist, so I think any adherence to any kind of collective worldview, collective ethnic identity, it would be foreign to him. And I think the whole family was actually very interesting. I mean, if we had more time, his father, Alexander Solomonovich, was one of several brothers of this big family whose roots go back to Yekaterinoslav or Dnipropetrovsk. And several of these brothers became very prominent lawyers before the revolution, also bibliophiles. They collected books, and several of them married Russian women. So marrying out of the faith, if you wish, was okay with them. Alexander Solomonovich, Alexander's father, was the only one who seemed to at least maintain some connections to his Jewish roots. And last summer I was in Kiev and I found some documents in the city archive of Kiev showing that, for example, Alexander was circumcised, that at least some degree of Jewishness was preserved. And of course, as I mentioned, Alexander Solomonovich was often a lawyer who spoke at trials having to do with discrimination against Jews. But in his autobiographical notes, Goldenweiser, the son, he mentions that as growing up in Kiev, he spoke German and French. So it's a very typical assimilated Russian Jewish intellectual kind of family. He loved Russian culture. It is known he adored Russian restaurants. In United States, you'd always find a Russian restaurant to eat at. He was a bit flamboyant, so he would drink champagne and then throw his glass into the fireplace and scream "Coutume russe," Russian custom. He was quite a character. So I think, I mean, his views on Israel really bothered me, of course, but that I think he was not alone in that. And
well, I also think he, perhaps in his case, maybe fortunately, did not live to see the Shoah and the death of his sisters. And I suspect it may have changed his views.
There are very interesting letters he exchanged with his younger brother, Alexei. And by the way, Alexei Goldenweiser's archive, which is quite large, it's at the Bakhmetiev archive at Columbia. And there you have letters that he exchanged with Nabokov. Yeah. And he corresponded with Aldanov, with a lot of the emigre intellectuals and writers that you, Maxim, are interested in.
Yes.
But in his letters to his brother Alexei, written right before he died, but already after World War II started in Europe, Goldenweiser, who was a pacifist, he was opposed to the war, But there in that letter, one letter, he says, because of Hitler, I think I have to modify my pacifist views. We have to do something about this. So I think he was shifting his views on that subject.
Right. So, Sergey, we have some wonderful questions from the audience,
Okay,
which
I'm
I'd
ready.
like to pose. The first one is, do we know what Goldenweiser thought of the American and Russian educational system? And it seems that he would be in a very privileged position to have enough perspective, enough distance to speak of both, comparatively perhaps as well.
I have no. He didn't write anything about the Soviet educational system. There is a wonderful. He filled out a form for Harvard alumni publication about his education at the Kievo-Pecherska Gymnasia, which is very famous apparently, and it's amazing to me how well educated he was. He read Plato and Virgil, and he read the Greeks. So he was extremely well educated, and I think he liked to quote from those authors. And then, as far as the American system, I mentioned a few passages from his writing where he advocates, the training of liberal, open-minded, and so forth. Again, I don't know if he taught at the Rand School, which is socialist sponsored, because he needed money or because he really sympathized with the socialists, or both. He also moonlighted at the Waldorf School in New York, which is for kids. So I think he was a progressive in that respect. The one thing I did not mention, which I think is important for at least those of you who are interested in the history of American anthropology, his career as an anthropologist was much less successful than that of his peers, such famous anthropologists, Edward Sapir, Paul Radin, Alfred Kroeber. He was a failure. And in fact, when he died, Boas wrote in a letter to another anthropologist saying, "What a wasted life," which I find very harsh. But Boas was very good at helping his proteges, his former graduate students, getting jobs. And he placed them in all the important departments throughout the country. Columbia, not so much Columbia, sorry, Berkeley, Stanford, Michigan, Chicago. And he wanted Goldenweiser to have that wonderful career, and it just didn't work out. And I think partly it was Goldenweiser's own fault because, as I said, he was a terrible womanizer. There's a wonderful letter that he wrote to a friend of his, another very well-known American anthropologist by the name of Robert Lowy. And this is during some anthropological congress at Berkeley. Goldenweiser writes, "Dear Lowy," and they were close friends, "I'm sorry I missed your presentation at the conference, but the game of pool was so much fun that I couldn't tear myself away." So, I mean, he was, according to his granddaughter, whom I interviewed recently, his wife was extremely jealous and she threatened to follow him with a pistol to shoot him if she found out that he was, fooling around behind her back. So
he got a pistol like Vera Nabokov.
Another friend of his mentioned that he was known for going out to eat with his friends, and then when it came time to pay the bill, say he forgot his wallet. So he was a bit of a character.
Right.
But in some ways, I admire him because he was very much alive. There was some kind of he was not a boring character.
Right. So, Sergey, there's another question. During his lifetime, were his theories discussed in the Soviet Union, and how is he viewed now in the post-Soviet space?
I think he was overshadowed by Boas, so I don't know if there isn't much written about him. There is now more of an interest in him, and one of my missions in life and what remains of my career, I'd like to write a book about him, but also maybe an article in Russian about him. There's a lot of interest, and not surprisingly, in Alexei. In fact, you would be interested, Maxim, and maybe some of our listeners, just literally a month ago, a very thick volume of Goldenweiser's younger brother, Alexei's correspondence came out, and that's based on the archive at Bakhmetiv. And it's presented as a glimpse of Russian and Russian Jewish immigrants between the two wars. So there's definitely an interest in the younger brother. I think Goldenweiser, again, he could have written more, but those few seminal papers of his are important, and I hope that there's still attention drawn to them. And in fact, he influenced some subsequent American anthropologists, for example, Clifford Geertz. So I'm not trying to make him more prominent than he was, but I think he is underappreciated. And I see my contribution is being able to read his Russian correspondence. And that includes his correspondence with his brothers and his daughter. They're all written in Russian. So
in fact, we had a question specifically about how much survives of his personal papers beyond his academic work.
That, and again, I think that's why he was never subject of a biography. We now have biographies, of course, of Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict and Sapir. But these people, most of their papers are in one place, like Ruth Benedict's at Vassar and so forth. His papers are scattered all over the country, and I've been searching for them for the past 10 years. I had to go to Reed College. There are some papers of his at the University of Washington in Seattle. And to my great delight, I found some of his papers in Kiev, because I didn't know that he actually studied at Kiev University for 1 year before he immigrated. And then the family maintains a large collection of photographs, and I use some of them in today's presentation. And the family has been very generous sharing those photographs, and family letters. And then his granddaughter, Leslie English, she told me quite a bit about his personal life and also about Alexei, because she knew him. Alexei died in 1979, and I really regret that in the 1970s, when I was already in America, I wasn't interested in Goldenweiser, because I could have interviewed his brother. But be it as it may, there's the archive is not as extensive, but it's actually pretty good. Also, something for historians of American anthropology, Margaret Mead, who actually was friendly with Goldenweiser, he gave her some advice on her dissertation, actually. She spread this kind of false rumor that he hated fieldwork, that the only thing he liked was lecturing and theorizing, but he hated actual ethnographic fieldwork. It's absolutely not true. So I've been fighting that myth. He enjoyed himself. He wrote an incredibly passionate and very sad obituary of his #1 Iroquois informant, John Gibson. It was published. He was again very unusual. For example, when he was at the Six Nations Reserve in Ontario, he would take a group of his Iroquois friends to Ontario on the Lake to hear an opera. I mean, who would think of ethnographic fieldworker doing that? He also played piano for them. He was a good piano player, studied piano in Kiev. So he was not your typical field researcher, but he enjoyed fieldwork, and I think he could have done more, but he had to make a living. He's your stereotypical adjunct professor that we have so many of those today who, jump from job to job.
Right. So Sergey, there was another question about perhaps a certain dichotomy between the public perception of Goldenweiser and his private perception, and how perhaps he's remembered in his family, as opposed to, you mentioned Margaret Mead having this very skewed idea of him as a scientist, as an academic.
And I think in my biography, I would like to discuss his personality and his flaws. I mean, he was a flawed individual. I think his, if he lived through the Me Too climate, he would have gotten in big trouble. There's a wonderful passage in Ruth Benedict's diary. She was his student at the New School, where she says, I went to see Goldenweiser. He proceeded to court me. He was trying to hit on her, basically. And she says, he was reading me letters from women who adore him. I don't know why he did that. Finally, he stopped, and then we had a wonderful discussion of anthropological theories. So, I mean, but despite that, Benedict wrote a very, very warm obituary. Boas was asked to write an obituary of Goldenweiser, and he refused. But Benedict wrote a very, very warm obituary.
So Sergei, as far as his anthropology peers,
Yeah.
beyond carousing with them, do you feel that they, A, really admired his work, and B, regarded him more as a Russian, an emigre, a European, something else?
I mean, they were all also either European born or Lowy came to the United States as a child. They all spoke more than one language, German, French. I think they shared that kind of European culture, high culture, Kultur. Did they think of him as Russian? Possibly. They like to call him Shura, so they use his nickname. I think they respected him. And certainly when he was in New York in the 19 teens and 20s, I mentioned these krushki, the circles that he organized. He was the intellectual heavyweight. And Boas actually considered him one of his brightest students. And then I think after he left the East Coast for the West Coast in the 30s, he was maybe his contact with his colleagues wasn't very strong, but he was respected. He was definitely respected. I think some of them tried to help him get a permanent job, but that didn't work out. There's basically more to Goldenweiser than you find in your standard history of American anthropology.
Right. Sergei, if I may, we will soon be concluding, unfortunately, but I'd like to ask you a somewhat more personal question. Rather, not personal, but a question that pertains to the larger trajectory of your career.
Sure.
Your earlier work dealt with Alaska's native populations. It involved the kind of field work that some thought Goldenweiser didn't want to do, but you clearly did it with a lot of passion and conviction. But then it brought you to these fascinating Jewish-Russian figures, firstly Lev Sternberg and now Alexander Goldenweiser. So I'm curious to know how this happened.
It's a very good question. I'm really glad you asked me. I think it's something you as an immigrant would understand. When I came to America, I really did not want to be identified with the Russian Jewish community of immigrants, especially in the first few years. As a number of my peers were studying, other immigrants, they were studying Russian history, Russian literature. I didn't want to do that. I used my knowledge of Russian and knowledge of Russian history. So I wrote some college papers about Russian anthropology, but I wanted to do something different. And of course, I used my Russian language skills because the Indians whose culture I was studying, they were part of Russian Alaska. So there was a large corpus of archival materials, particularly church documents, that I used in my writing. But I did not want to either teach Russian subjects or write about it. I didn't want to maintain ties with Soviet anthropologists. I was really against all that. But I think as I matured, and even, when I got married, which was in 76, and my wife is also from the Soviet Union, we avoided immigrants. But as we got older, I think our roots they became more important. And now looking back, something you probably could identify with, my closest friends remain Russians, particularly Russian Jews. And so I became really interested in the history of anthropology in general, but especially in this very interesting question of why there's so many Jews among anthropologists. And this is true of, to some extent, Russia, but also America and France, if you think of Levi-Strauss and Marcel Mauss and Durkheim. So I think maturity and also as when I came to the United States, my own Jewish identity was pretty tenuous. Whereas gradually I became more interested in, Jewish holidays and had a Jewish wedding and things like that. So I think it's my own maturing and aging and also becoming more interested in Jewish issues that was sort of parallel to my intellectual interest. And working on Sternberg, I didn't realize when I started the project on Sternberg that he was not only a very prominent anthropologist, but he was actually quite active in Jewish political and circles, much more than Goldenweiser. But after I published Sternberg's biography, I wanted to do something about American anthropology. Also, as you probably know, it is a lot easier, more comfortable working in American archives than in Soviet ones, or Russian post-Soviet ones. So, but I've gotten more involved with Russian colleagues. I publish in Russian now on the history of anthropology, because when it comes to the history of Russian anthropology, I think they are particularly interested in those issues. So I hope I've answered your question.
Absolutely. No, and in fact, this is a great note on which to end our conversation, which is to be continued. We're very much looking to your book, Sergey, and I'd like to thank you so very much for your illuminating presentation. I'd like to thank our audience for being with us, and we hope to see you on November 18th for Lube Jorgensen's talk. And for now, please stay well, please stay healthy. It's wonderful to see you all.
Will I be able to see watch my talk on Facebook?
I am sure you will.
Okay.
Very soon. Thank you, Sergey.
Thank you for inviting me. I enjoyed myself very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.